It was another dreary, rain-soaked evening at the Riverside Diner, where the sound of heavy rain pattered relentlessly against the windows. Rachel stood behind the counter, wiping down the same spot she'd cleaned at least a dozen times that evening. The diner had been slow all night, with only a few regulars sitting quietly at their tables, sipping coffee and eating the usual greasy comfort food. Rachel's life had become a repetitive cycle of long shifts, cramped apartment living, and the silent, gnawing worry of paying bills. Her co-workers moved through their duties like clockwork. Conversations with customers were shallow, and her boss, Mrs. Carver, made sure nobody had the time or energy to be anything but efficient. But tonight, as Rachel stood near the window, she noticed something that pulled her attention away from the monotony. A small figure stood outside, barely illuminated by the weak streetlights. A young boy, no older than 8 or 9, was huddled under the overhang, his thin jacket soaked through. He pressed his small hands against the glass, his eyes wide and fixed on the plates of food inside the diner. Rachel's heart twisted. The boy's clothes were threadbare, clinging to his small frame, his hair plastered to his head from the relentless rain. His pale, pinched face spoke of hunger, and the way he stared longingly at the diner's meals reminded her too much of her own childhood, back when meals were few and far between. Without thinking, she grabbed one of the few orders that hadn't yet been picked up, fried chicken with mashed potatoes and gravy. Her feet moved on instinct, her heart full of compassion. She stepped outside into the cold rain, feeling the chill of the wind biting through her thin uniform. The boy flinched when the door creaked open, but didn't move away. Rachel knelt in front of him, holding the warm meal in her hands. "Here, take this," she said gently, offering him the plate. "You look like you could use something warm." The boy blinked up at her, his large round eyes filled with disbelief. "For me?" he asked softly, his voice trembling. Not from the cold, but from uncertainty. He hadn't expected anyone to notice him, let alone show him kindness. He had long since learned to blend into the background, invisible to the world. Rachel smiled and nodded, pushing the plate closer. "It's for you. Don't worry about anything, okay? Just eat." Tears welled up in the boy's eyes, but he quickly blinked them away, taking the plate as if it were the most precious thing in the world. He mumbled a quiet, "Thank you," before tearing into the food, his hunger too strong to wait another second. Rachel stood up, her heart swelling with warmth at the sight. She knew she wasn't solving the boy's problems, but at least for tonight, he wouldn't go to bed hungry. The small act filled her with a sense of purpose, a reminder that she could still make a difference, no matter how insignificant it might seem to the world. But her moment of peace was short-lived. Just as she was about to return inside, the door slammed open and Mrs. Carver stormed out. Rachel froze. Mrs. Carver was a woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper business acumen. She didn't care about people, only profits. And the sight of Rachel giving away food was enough to send her into a rage. "What in the world do you think you're doing?" Mrs. Carver snapped, her voice cutting through the rain like a whip. Her eyes, cold and unforgiving, locked onto Rachel's like she was a criminal caught in the act. Rachel opened her mouth to explain, but Mrs. Carver wasn't in the mood for explanations. "Do you think we're running a soup kitchen here? Giving food to beggars like that? I don't care what his situation is. This isn't a charity, Rachel." The boy looked up, his wide eyes filled with fear. Rachel's heart ached for him, but she knew this was no time to argue. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Carver," she said quietly. "He was hungry, and I—" "Sorry?" Mrs. Carver's face twisted with fury. "You think an apology fixes wasting our food on someone who can't even pay for it? You're costing me money, Rachel. You're wasting my resources. Do you know how many people out there would love to have this job? If you can't follow basic rules, then maybe you're not cut out for it." Rachel's face flushed with humiliation. She wanted to speak up, to say that helping someone in need wasn't wrong, but the reality of her situation hit her hard. She couldn't afford to lose this job. But even as she thought that, she knew deep down she couldn't regret what she had done. "I'm sorry, but I couldn't just—" "You couldn't just what? Show some common sense? Well, I can't just keep you around if you're going to be this careless." Mrs. Carver spat. Without another word, she crossed her arms and delivered the final blow. "You're fired, Rachel. Get your things and leave. Now." Rachel stood there, the weight of the words crashing over her like a tidal wave. Fired. Her stomach dropped, her chest tightened with panic, but there was no arguing with Mrs. Carver. The decision was final, her fate sealed. The boy, still holding his meal, stared up at Rachel, his expression filled with guilt and sorrow. He didn't say anything, but the silent apology in his eyes broke her heart. She gave him a small, shaky smile, trying to reassure him that it wasn't his fault. As the boy disappeared into the night, clutching his meal, Rachel turned back toward the diner. The world felt colder, harsher, as if the warmth of her small act of kindness had been snuffed out by the reality of her situation. She grabbed her jacket from the break room, her hands trembling as she shoved her belongings into her bag. The walk home was slow, the rain now a steady drizzle. Each step felt heavier than the last as Rachel tried to process what had just happened. How had one act of kindness spiraled into losing her job? She had done the right thing, hadn't she? But now, with no income and no security, Rachel couldn't help but feel the weight of her decision. As she reached her tiny apartment, soaked and exhausted, she sat down on her bed and let the silence engulf her. In her heart, she knew she would do it all over again. She would help the boy again, no matter the cost. But for the first time, the uncertainty of her future loomed large, and Rachel couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Before continuing, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. This really helps a lot and allows us to keep bringing you more amazing content. Your support makes all the difference to us. Now let's continue. The next day, a heavy, oppressive silence filled Rachel's small apartment. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the peeling paint on the walls, her thoughts consumed by the events of the previous night. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a dull gray sky that matched the weight in her chest. Her job, her only source of income, was gone, and all because she had done something out of compassion. It didn't seem fair. Her apartment was small and modest, with just enough space for the essentials: a bed, a chipped wooden table, and a rickety chair by the window. The light that filtered through the curtains was dim, casting long shadows across the room. The space, once a refuge from her long shifts, now felt like a prison, trapping her in a reality she wasn't ready to face. Bills were already piling up on the counter, and with each passing hour, the dread of not knowing how to pay them grew heavier. Rachel sighed and buried her face in her hands, her mind spiraling through the same thoughts again and again. Had she made the right decision? She had acted out of kindness, yes, but was it worth the price she now had to pay? Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the boy's face. The way his eyes had widened with shock when she offered him the meal. The way he had devoured the food as if it were the first thing he'd eaten in days. That moment of gratitude, the brief connection she'd felt with him, had made it all seem worthwhile. But now, in the cold light of day, doubt gnawed at her. She had no job, no backup plan, and only a few meager savings to get her through the next month, if she was lucky. Mrs. Carver's harsh words echoed in her mind, twisting like a knife in her gut. This isn't a charity, Rachel. For the first time since losing her job, Rachel felt the full weight of her decision crashing down on her. Fear crept into her heart, its icy fingers gripping tight. What was she going to do? The thought of pounding the pavement, searching for another job in the unforgiving city, felt daunting. She had no connections, no one to vouch for her. Jobs were hard enough to come by, and now she had to explain to potential employers why she'd been fired. Would anyone understand? Rachel glanced at the stack of bills on her kitchen counter. Rent was due in less than 2 weeks. Her utilities were behind. How long could she last before everything came crashing down around her? The life she had worked so hard to build felt like it was unraveling, thread by thread. Her stomach churned with worry, and her fingers clenched the edge of her bed, as if holding on would somehow stop the world from spinning out of control. Despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, she couldn't shake the conviction that what she had done was right. That boy had needed help, and she had been there for him. If kindness had a price, then maybe it was one worth paying. But the reality of her situation was inescapable, and as the hours dragged on, the weight of it all pressed down on her harder than ever. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one a reminder of her growing desperation. By noon, she found herself pacing the small apartment, the walls closing in around her. The silence was unbearable. She couldn't sit still, couldn't escape the gnawing anxiety that filled her chest. Every option she considered seemed impossible. She thought about calling her friends, but what could they do? They were all struggling in their own ways, working dead-end jobs just to get by. And then there was the boy. She couldn't stop thinking about him. Where had he gone after he disappeared into the night? Was he safe? Warm? Had anyone else helped him? The questions swirled in her mind, refusing to leave her alone. What kind of world was this, where helping someone in need could lead to punishment? The injustice of it all made her stomach twist. But there was nothing she could do now. Just as she was about to collapse onto her bed and let the despair consume her, a sharp knock echoed through the apartment. Rachel froze, her heart skipping a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. Who could it be? For a moment, fear gripped her. She had no idea what was waiting on the other side of the door. Her mind raced through a dozen possibilities. Maybe it was Mrs. Carver, coming to berate her one last time, or maybe it was the landlord, demanding rent she couldn't pay. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Rachel stood, her legs unsteady, and made her way to the door. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the knob, before finally pulling it open. Standing in the doorway was a man Rachel had never seen before. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, with neatly combed hair and a serious expression. His eyes were calm but intense, and Rachel's pulse quickened as she tried to figure out who he was and what he could possibly want. "Are you Rachel?" he asked, his voice smooth but firm. Rachel swallowed, her throat dry. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "Can I help you?" The man's expression softened slightly, and he nodded. "My name is David Lawson. I believe you recently helped a young boy. I'm here about that." Rachel's mind raced, her thoughts colliding in confusion. The boy? What did this man have to do with him? And why was he here now, of all times? She stepped back, gesturing for him to come inside, though every part of her was on edge. David stepped into the apartment, his eyes scanning the room briefly before turning back to Rachel. "I know you're probably wondering why I'm here, but let me explain. That boy you helped, he's my son." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. His son? The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but it still didn't explain why this man was standing in her living room. "I've been searching for him for weeks," David continued, his voice thick with emotion. "He ran away from home after an argument, and I've been doing everything I can to find him. When I heard what you did for him, giving him food, showing him kindness, I knew I had to come and thank you in person." Rachel blinked, stunned by his words. The boy she had helped, the one who had looked so lost and hungry, was this man's son? The realization hit her like a tidal wave, and she struggled to find her voice. "I didn't do much," she said quietly, still trying to wrap her mind around everything. "He looked like he needed help, so I gave him something to eat. That's all." David shook his head, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You don't understand. What you did meant the world to him, and to me. When he came home and told me about you, I couldn't believe it. In a world where people so often turn a blind eye to those in need, you did the opposite. You helped him when he needed it most. I can't thank you enough for that." Rachel's heart swelled, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over her. She had spent the entire day regretting her decision, questioning whether her act of kindness had been worth the cost. But now, hearing this man's words, she realized that her small gesture had made a difference after all. David reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope, handing it to her. "I know this doesn't make up for what happened to you, but I want to help in any way I can. Please, take this." Rachel hesitated, her eyes flicking between the envelope and David's sincere expression. Slowly, she reached out and took it, her fingers trembling slightly. She opened the envelope and found a check inside, a sum far greater than she could have ever imagined. Her breath caught in her throat, and she looked up at David, speechless. "I know you lost your job because of what you did," he said, his voice softening. "And I know that life hasn't been easy for you, but I hope this can help you get back on your feet and maybe give you a little more time to figure out your next step." Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes as the weight of his words sank in. She had spent the day feeling hopeless, unsure of what her future held. But now everything had changed in an instant. The kindness she had shown had come back to her in ways she never could have anticipated. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. David smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. You don't have to say anything. Just know that your kindness didn't go unnoticed. Rachel stood frozen in the doorway, her mind struggling to keep pace with the unfolding events. She had never expected that her simple act of kindness would lead to something like this. She motioned for the man, Mr. Clark, to come in, her heart pounding in her chest. A million thoughts raced through her mind as she stepped aside, watching him enter her small, modest apartment. He carried himself with an air of importance, his suit neatly pressed, his shoes polished to a gleam. His presence filled the room, making her humble surroundings feel even smaller. Rachel had always prided herself on keeping her apartment tidy, but as she glanced around, she couldn't help but notice the cracks in the walls, the mismatched furniture, and the threadbare rug. It was far from the luxury that Mr. Clark seemed accustomed to. She quickly pushed the thought aside. Now wasn't the time to be worrying about appearances. What could this possibly be about? Who was this important person Mr. Clark spoke of? Mr. Clark cleared his throat politely and took a seat at the small kitchen table. Rachel followed, her mind still spinning. She had no idea what to expect, but the weight of the situation settled heavily on her shoulders. She could feel the tension in the air as Mr. Clark folded his hands in front of him, his expression serious yet kind. "Thank you for inviting me in, Ms. Evans," he said with a slight nod. "I understand this may come as a surprise to you, but I'm here on behalf of someone very important who wishes to express his gratitude for your recent act of kindness." Rachel blinked, confused. She couldn't imagine who would care so much about what she'd done. She had simply helped a hungry boy. It wasn't anything extraordinary, at least not in her eyes. "Gratitude?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For what exactly?" Mr. Clark smiled, a knowing glint in his eye. "For helping a young boy who was in need," he explained calmly. "The boy you bought a meal for the other day, he is no ordinary child. His name is Jacob, and he is the son of a very prominent businessman. His father, Mr. Donovan, is someone with considerable influence, though his family has been facing some difficult times as of late." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The boy she had helped, Jacob, was the son of a businessman? Her mind raced back to that moment outside the diner, when she had seen him standing in the rain, looking lost and hungry. He hadn't seemed like the child of someone wealthy. He had looked so vulnerable, so alone. She hadn't thought twice about helping him. It was just the right thing to do. But now, hearing this revelation, the gravity of her actions began to sink in. "Jacob ran away from home," Mr. Clark continued, his tone gentle but steady. "He felt ashamed of their situation, of the hardships his family was going through. He didn't know how to face it, so he left. His father has been searching for him ever since, desperate to bring him home." Rachel's heart ached as she listened to the story. She couldn't imagine the pain Jacob's father must have felt, not knowing where his son was, fearing the worst. And all because of pride, because Jacob didn't want his father to see how much he was hurting. She understood that feeling all too well, the desire to hide your struggles, to appear strong even when everything was falling apart. "I had no idea," Rachel murmured, her voice filled with sympathy. I saw him standing there, looking so hungry, and I couldn't just walk away. I didn't think about who he was or where he came from. I just wanted to help." Mr. Clark nodded, his eyes softening with admiration. "That's exactly why I'm here," he said. "Your act of kindness, though small in your eyes, had a tremendous impact. Because of you, Jacob was found. He returned home, and his father is eternally grateful. He wishes to meet you in person to thank you." Rachel's eyes widened in shock. The boy's father wanted to meet her? It seemed unreal. She had been fired from her job for what she did, and now this man was offering her gratitude, and more importantly, recognition for something she had done without a second thought. "I don't know what to say," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I didn't do it for any reward or recognition. I just wanted to help a child who needed it." Mr. Clark smiled again, this time warmly. "I understand, Ms. Evans, and that is precisely why Mr. Donovan is so eager to meet you. He knows that you acted out of genuine kindness, and that is a rare thing in this world. His family has been through a difficult time, But your gesture gave them hope. It reminded them that there is still goodness in people, even when life seems at its darkest. Rachel's heart swelled with a mixture of emotions: relief, pride, gratitude. She had spent the past day questioning whether she had made the right choice, whether her decision to help Jacob had been worth the cost of losing her job. But now, hearing these words, she knew in her heart that she had done the right thing. No amount of money or security could replace the feeling of knowing she had made a difference in someone's life. Still, the thought of meeting Jacob's father, a man of influence and power, left her feeling nervous. She was just a waitress, someone who had struggled her whole life to make ends meet. What could she possibly have to offer someone like him? And yet Mr. Clark's words gave her courage. Perhaps this was her chance to find something greater than the life she had been living. "I would be honored to meet him," Rachel said finally, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. Mr. Clark nodded in approval. "I'll arrange a meeting for you both soon," he said, standing up from the table. "But before I go, there's one more thing." Rachel looked up at him, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Reaching into his coat pocket, Mr. Clark pulled out a small envelope and handed it to her. "Mr. Donovan asked me to give you this as a token of his gratitude. He knows that you lost your job because of what you did for his son, and he wishes to help you during this time of transition." Rachel hesitated for a moment before accepting the envelope. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a check inside. Her eyes widened in disbelief at the amount. It was far more than she could have ever imagined. The sum was enough to cover her rent, bills, and more for several months. I don't know what to say," Rachel stammered, tears welling up in her eyes. "This is too much." Mr. Clark smiled gently. "It's not too much for someone who did the right thing when no one else would. Mr. Donovan believes in rewarding those who show true kindness, and this is his way of thanking you." Rachel clutched the envelope, her mind racing with gratitude and disbelief. She had lost her job, yes, but in return, she had gained something far more valuable: hope, recognition, and a sense of purpose. For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt like she wasn't just drifting through life, surviving day by day. She had made a difference, and now the future didn't seem so bleak. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Please, thank Mr. Donovan for me. I don't know how I could ever repay him for this kindness." "You already have," Mr. Clark said with a soft smile. "By helping his son, you've given him something no amount of money could buy." With that, Mr. Clark rose from the table and made his way to the door. Rachel followed, still trying to process everything that had just happened. As he left, he turned back to her one last time. "I'll be in touch about the meeting with Mr. Donovan," he said. "In the meantime, take care of yourself, Ms. Evans. You've earned it." And with that, he was gone, leaving Rachel standing in her doorway, the envelope clutched in her hands. She closed the door behind him and leaned against it, her mind whirling with the possibilities ahead. The storm that had been looming over her life seemed to be clearing, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could see a glimpse of light on the horizon. The day dawned bright and crisp as Rachel stood nervously in front of an enormous iron gate. Beyond it loomed a mansion that looked like something out of a dream, or perhaps a life she'd only ever glimpsed from the outside. The house was grand, a towering estate with intricate stonework and ivy crawling up its walls. Every corner of the property exuded wealth, from the perfectly manicured lawns to the ornate fountain bubbling in the circular driveway. It was a far cry from her tiny, modest apartment, and as Rachel stood there, she couldn't help but feel a surge of doubt. "What am I doing here?" she muttered under her breath. The events of the past few days still felt surreal to her. One moment, she had been a waitress scraping by, fired for a simple act of kindness. And now, here she was, standing in front of the home of one of the most influential businessmen in the city, invited for a personal meeting. The difference in her world and this one couldn't have been starker. As Rachel shifted her weight from foot to foot, the gate slowly opened with a soft, mechanical hum. Mr. Clark had arranged everything. He had called that morning, informing her that Mr. Edwards, the boy's father, wanted to meet her in person to thank her for helping his son. Rachel didn't know what to expect from the encounter, but her curiosity had won out over her nerves. Just then, a sleek black car pulled up in front of her, and the window rolled down, revealing Mr. Clark. He greeted her with the same calm, professional demeanor as before, but there was something softer in his expression today. "Good morning, Ms. Evans. Are you ready?" Rachel nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was truly prepared for what awaited her. She climbed into the car and they began the short drive up the winding path to the mansion's front entrance. The closer they got, the more imposing the house seemed. Her stomach churned with a mix of anxiety and curiosity, but she forced herself to take deep breaths. This meeting wasn't about her. It was about the boy, Jacob, and the gratitude his father wanted to express. The car came to a smooth stop in front of the mansion's grand entrance. Mr. Clark stepped out first, opening the door for Rachel with a courteous nod. She took a deep breath and exited the vehicle, her heart racing in her chest. As she looked up at the towering double doors, they swung open, revealing an elegantly dressed man waiting for her just inside. He was tall, with a commanding presence that matched the grandeur of his home. His dark hair was graying at the temples, and his face bore the lines of someone who had seen both great success and great hardship. His eyes, though weary, were warm and filled with an emotion Rachel couldn't quite place. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper, something like hope. "Ms. Evans," he greeted her, his voice deep but kind. "Thank you for coming." Rachel swallowed hard, feeling both out of place and overwhelmed. "Mr. Edwards," she replied, giving him a small nod. "It's an honor to meet you." He gestured for her to step inside, and Rachel took her first hesitant steps into the mansion's grand foyer. It was even more magnificent than she had imagined. Marble floors stretched out beneath her feet, while crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the space. Every inch of the room spoke of wealth and refinement, from the carefully chosen artwork to the richly upholstered furniture. But despite its grandeur, there was something melancholic about the atmosphere, as if the house itself carried the weight of the family's recent troubles. "Please, follow me," Mr. Edwards said, his voice carrying a gentleness that put Rachel slightly more at ease. She followed him down a long hallway, lined with portraits of what she assumed were ancestors, before finally arriving at a smaller, more intimate sitting room. The space was cozy, with soft armchairs and a fireplace crackling in the corner. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and lavender, a comforting scent that contrasted with the grandeur she had seen so far. "Have a seat," Mr. Edwards said, motioning to one of the chairs. Rachel sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had so many questions, but wasn't sure where to begin. Thankfully, Mr. Edwards spoke first. "Ms. Evans," he began, his tone measured but sincere, "I want to thank you for what you did for my son. Jacob has been through a lot these past few months. Our family has fallen on hard times. My business, which was once thriving, collapsed under the weight of some unfortunate decisions, and we lost everything. The stress of it all weighed heavily on Jacob. He felt responsible in some ways, even though none of it was his fault. So he ran away." Rachel's heart clenched at the thought of Jacob, alone and vulnerable, hiding his pain from those who loved him most. "He ran away because he was ashamed," Mr. Edwards continued, his voice breaking slightly. "He didn't want me to see how much the situation was affecting him, and in doing so, he disappeared for days. I searched everywhere, desperate to find him. And then, by some miracle, you came along. You found him when I couldn't, and you showed him kindness when he needed it most." Rachel shifted uncomfortably, still not used to being praised for something she felt was so simple. "I just bought him a meal," she said quietly. "Anyone would have done the same." Mr. Edwards shook his head. "No, Ms. Evans, not everyone would have done what you did. In this world, too many people look the other way when they see someone in need. But you didn't. You saw my son and you helped him without expecting anything in return. That's not something I can overlook." He paused for a moment, his eyes searching Rachel's face. "You reminded my family that there is still goodness in the world, even when everything feels hopeless. You gave us hope, Ms. Evans, and for that I will always be grateful." Rachel felt her cheeks flush with emotion. She hadn't expected this level of gratitude, let alone the deep impact her actions had had on Mr. Edwards and his family. It was both humbling and overwhelming. "I'm just glad he's safe," Rachel said softly. "That's all that matters." Mr. Edwards smiled, though there was a sadness in his eyes that spoke of the struggles he and his family had endured. Indeed, Jacob is safe, and our family is slowly rebuilding. But I would like to do something for you in return. I know you lost your job because of what you did for Jacob. That's an injustice I can't ignore. So I'd like to offer you a position. Rachel blinked, not sure she had heard him correctly. A position? She repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. Mr. Edwards nodded. I've recently started a new business venture. It's still in its early stages, but I believe it has great potential. It's a nonprofit organization focused on helping families in need, those who, like mine, have fallen on hard times. We provide resources, support, and job opportunities to help them get back on their feet. Rachel's eyes widened as she listened. It was a noble cause, one she had never imagined being a part of. But as Mr. Edwards spoke, she felt a stirring in her heart, a sense that this was exactly where she was meant to be. I want you to be a part of it, Ms. Evans, Mr. Edwards said, his voice full of conviction. You've shown me that you understand the importance of kindness, of helping those who need it most. I believe you could make a real difference. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. It was more than she could have ever dreamed of, a chance to not only rebuild her own life, but to help others do the same. The weight of her previous worries, her uncertainty about the future, seemed to lift as she considered the offer. I don't know what to say, Rachel stammered, her voice thick with emotion. It's incredible. I'd be honored. Mr. Edwards smiled warmly, the sadness in his eyes giving way to something brighter. The honor is mine, Ms. Evans. You've already made a difference in my life, and I have no doubt you'll do the same for countless others. As the conversation continued, Rachel's heart swelled with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. What had started as a simple act of kindness had blossomed into something far greater, an opportunity to change lives, including her own. She had been through so much uncertainty, but now, standing in Mr. Edwards' grand home, she knew her path was clear. This was her new beginning. Weeks had passed since Rachel accepted Mr. Edwards' generous offer, and as she sat at her new desk, she couldn't help but marvel at how drastically her life had transformed. The walls of her office were painted a warm beige, adorned with motivational posters that echoed the organization's mission. Together, we rise. It felt surreal. Just a few months ago, she had been a waitress at the local diner, barely scraping by, and now she was in a position that allowed her to make a meaningful impact in the world. With a soft sigh, she leaned back in her chair, the weight of her journey settling around her like a warm embrace. The clattering of keyboards and the quiet hum of conversation from her colleagues surrounded her, but in that moment, she was lost in thought. The memories of that rainy day when she had spotted the hungry boy still played vividly in her mind, a pivotal moment that had set everything in motion. Rachel glanced out the window, watching as the sun streamed through the clouds, bathing the city in golden light. It was a beautiful day, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. She remembered the boy's tearful eyes when she handed him the meal, the pure gratitude etched in his face, and how it had reminded her of the power of compassion. In her new role, Rachel was responsible for organizing outreach programs aimed at assisting families struggling with poverty, just like the Edwards had once experienced. Her passion for helping others, ignited by that single act of kindness, fueled her every day. She had spent countless hours researching resources, connecting with local shelters, and speaking to families in need. Each interaction deepened her commitment to her mission. As she was lost in her thoughts, there was a soft knock on her office door. It was Mr. Clark, her right-hand man in the organization. He entered with a warm smile, his face lighting up the room. "Hey, Rachel, ready for the meeting with the board?" he asked, his enthusiasm infectious. Rachel nodded, pushing herself to her feet. "Absolutely! Let's do this!" She felt a tingle of excitement course through her. It was her first meeting with the board since she started working at the nonprofit, and she wanted to showcase the ideas she had developed over the past weeks. With Mr. Edwards' mentorship and Mr. Clark's support, she had crafted several initiatives aimed at raising awareness and funds for their cause. They made their way to the conference room where the board members were already gathered. Rachel took a deep breath, reminding herself that she had a voice and a purpose. The board members were an eclectic mix of seasoned professionals and enthusiastic newcomers, all united by a shared vision of helping those in need. As she entered, the murmurs faded, and all eyes turned to her. Rachel felt a flutter of nerves, but she quickly reminded herself of why she was there. She had a story to share. Her story, the story of how a simple act of kindness had the power to ignite change. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice steady and confident. "I'm excited to share some ideas that I believe can take our outreach efforts to the next level." As she presented her proposals, detailing plans for community workshops, fundraisers, and partnerships with local businesses, Rachel felt a rush of energy. The board listened intently, nodding along as she spoke passionately about the impact they could make. Each of these initiatives is not just about raising funds. It's about building relationships with our community, she emphasized. We need to show families that we care and that they are not alone in their struggles. We can provide them with resources and support, just like I did for that little boy. When she finished, the room erupted into applause, and a sense of accomplishment washed over her. The board members began discussing her ideas enthusiastically, offering suggestions and sharing their own experiences. For the first time, Rachel felt a true sense of belonging among them. She wasn't just an employee, she was a valued member of a team working toward a common goal. As the meeting concluded, Mr. Edwards entered, a proud smile on his face. Rachel felt a surge of gratitude toward him for believing in her and giving her this opportunity. "That was excellent, Rachel," he praised, clapping her on the shoulder. "Your passion is contagious. The board is excited about your ideas." "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," Rachel replied, her heart swelling with pride. "I couldn't have done it without your support." Over the next few weeks, Rachel immersed herself in her new role, working tirelessly to bring her ideas to fruition. She found herself collaborating with local schools, hosting community events, and even reaching out to local businesses for sponsorships. The response was overwhelmingly positive, and soon the organization was gaining traction. One afternoon, as Rachel was sorting through a stack of community feedback forms, she received a surprise visit from Jacob, the boy she had helped that fateful day. He was now taller, with bright eyes and a wide grin that lit up his face. "Rachel," he exclaimed, running into her office, "I wanted to see how you were doing." "Jacob, it's so great to see you." Rachel beamed, kneeling to meet him at eye level. "How's everything going with you?" "Really good," he replied, his voice bubbling with excitement. "Dad said we're going to help you with one of those community events you're planning." Rachel felt a warmth spread through her heart at the thought of Jacob wanting to be involved. "That's wonderful. We could really use your help. Would you like to volunteer?" "Can I?" Jacob asked, his eyes wide with enthusiasm. "Of course. You'll be a fantastic help," she assured him. "And you know what? I think you'll inspire a lot of other kids too." Over the next few days, Jacob and Rachel worked side by side, planning for the upcoming community outreach event. As they brainstormed ideas and prepared activities, Rachel couldn't help but admire the young boy's spirit and resilience. He had gone from feeling ashamed of his circumstances to actively participating in efforts to help others. It was a testament to how far he had come and how far they had all come together. The day of the event arrived, and excitement filled the air. The community center was transformed into a vibrant space full of laughter, activities, and information booths. Families gathered, eager to learn about the resources available to them, while children engaged in fun games and crafts. Rachel felt a surge of joy as she saw people coming together, united by the desire to support one another. As the day unfolded, Rachel took a moment to step back and soak it all in. She watched as Jacob helped younger kids paint signs, the laughter ringing out like music. She saw families connecting with local service providers, forging new relationships that would support them in their time of need. It was everything she had hoped for, and more. At the end of the day, as the sun began to set and the community center was filled with the warmth of shared stories and newfound friendships, Rachel took a moment to reflect on her journey. She had gone from feeling lost and uncertain to being surrounded by a community that felt like family. Every act of kindness she had shared had come full circle, and she realized how interconnected their lives had become. When the last family left and the center began to quiet down, Mr. Edwards approached Rachel, a satisfied smile on his face. "You did it, Rachel. You brought our vision to life," he said, pride evident in his voice. Rachel beamed at him. I couldn't have done it without your support and guidance. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for reminding us all of the power of kindness, he replied. You've not only transformed your life, but the lives of many others as well. This is just the beginning. As she stood there, surrounded by the remnants of the day's success, Rachel felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She realized that life was full of unexpected twists and turns, and sometimes the most profound changes began with a single act of kindness. In that moment, she made a silent promise to herself. She would continue to spread kindness wherever she could, using her voice to uplift others and create a brighter future. With hope in her heart and a new purpose guiding her, Rachel knew that the journey ahead was filled with possibilities. She had found her place, not just in the organization, but within herself. And as she looked out at the city bathed in the soft glow of twilight, she felt a sense of peace. This was her life now, and it was just the beginning. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you thought about the story and share any themes or ideas you'd like to hear in future stories. Your feedback means the world to me. Thanks for watching.